All right, we're about to wrap up our algebra topics. All right, this is solving rational equations. A rational equation is a fraction. The ones that we're going to focus on are either going to be a proportion or some kind of basic ones where we have to find a common denominator. All right, so to start with, my proportion. All right, if I want to solve a proportion, that means you have a fraction equals a fraction. So one way of solving it is to cross multiply. So that means that A times D equals B times C. And then we can solve from there. All right, the least common denominator, LCD, right, that's our least common denominator. That's what we have to do anytime we want to add and subtract fractions. But it's not as bad as it sounds, okay? So doing least common denominator is not that bad, okay? And then the one big thing, big deal over here. You can never, ever, ever have 0 in the denominator, okay? If you end up with a 0 in the denominator, when you plug back in, that's going to be an extraneous solution. So just like with our radicals, we do have to plug back in and make sure that we don't have 0 in the denominator. Okay, so the first two are our proportions. So I'm going to solve these by cross multiplying. Right now, it doesn't matter if you put the B times C equals A times D or vice versa. I like to keep my X on the left if I can. It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to do 4 times X plus 2 equals 10 times 3. And again, it doesn't matter as long as you have the right pairs. Right? Distribute, so we get 4X plus 8. 10 times 3 is 30. And now it's linear. I'm just solving for X. So I'm going to subtract 8. So then we get 22, and then divide by 4. So I get 22 over 4, right, which I can simplify to 11 over 2. Double check. Now, one thing we could do from the very beginning is look to see what would make our denominator 0. So the only time I potentially could have 0 is in this denominator. And if I were to plug in a -2, -2 plus 2 is 0. So that tells me that X cannot be -2. This is what we call an excluded value. So when I solved, I got 11 over 2, which was not -2, so that means my answer is good. It's not extraneous. All right, for the next one, we're going to cross multiply, but before we do, I'm going to figure out my excluded values. So to make this denominator 0, I would have a -9, so I can't have a -9, and I have another X over here, and a -5 would make that 0. So I'm going to solve like normal, but I just got to make sure I don't get a -9 or a -5. So I got 6 times X plus 5 and a 4 times X plus 9. Distribute, 6 times X, 6 times 5, 4 times X, 4 times 9. Got to get X on the same side, so I'm going to subtract the 4X over. So I get 2X plus 30 equals 36. Subtract the 30. 2x equals 6, divide by 2, x equals 3. I did not get one of those excluded values, so we're good. All right, finding your common denominator. The same idea, we can figure out our excluded values, but find your common denominator first, because that's going to help you a little more find your excluded values. Okay, remember, when you are doing these problems, if you have a number that's not written as a fraction, you can write anything over 1, and then you have a fraction. So I want to find a common denominator, a number that X, and 1 all go into, or a term. So 1 goes into anything. So I can make 1 any denominator that I want. So I'm going to say my common denominator is X. All right. Once you figure out your common denominator, you need to make sure everything has that common denominator. So here I have an X, here I have an X, but 1 is an X. To get to your common denominator, we multiply top and bottom by whatever's missing. All right. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to use my common denominator to figure out what X cannot be. So X cannot be anything that makes that common denominator 0. So in this case, X just can't be 0. That's my only excluded value. All right, now once you have your common denominator, the best part about solving these is that I don't even need the fraction anymore. I don't need my denominator. Once they all have the same denominator, that's irrelevant. So I'm going to have X minus 6 equals X plus 4 plus 1 times X, which is just X. I'm going to combine my like terms over here. So X minus 6 equals 2X plus 4. right? I got to get my x's on the same side, so I'll subtract 2x over. So I get negative x minus 6 equals 4. Add 6, negative x equals 10. Divide by that negative 1. So we get a negative 10, which is not 0, so we're good. Okay, for the second one, right, I have x, 5x, and 5x, right? So obviously 5x and the 5x are the same, so those are good. So I need something that has an x and a 5x in it, and that's actually 5x. So my common denominator is 5x because that has the 5x and it has the x in it. The only one that doesn't have that 5x is the first one, so I'm going to multiply by 5 to get to that 5x, and then I don't need my denominator anymore. So I have 5 times 1 equals 1 minus, now careful, I'm not subtracting in, I'm subtracting the whole thing. Anytime you are subtracting, put it in parentheses. It's a good habit, right? That way you don't forget that you have to distribute a negative. All right, so before we go any further, if I wanted 5x to equal 0, the only thing that would get me there is 0. So x can't be 0 because 5 times 0 is 0. All right, I'm going to start by distributing that negative. So 5 equals 1 minus n plus 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So we have 2 minus n. Subtract the 2 over. 3 equals negative n. Divide by negative 1. And we get negative 3. Not 0. So it's good. And our last one, right, my common denominator has to be something that all of these go into. So the number has to be something that 1, 3, and 6 go into. And 1, 3, and 6 all go into 6. And then I have to have something that has x squared and x in it. So that's going to be x squared because x goes into x squared. So this covers everything, right? Just like last time, the only thing that would make this 0 is 0, right? 6 times 0 squared. Any other number, I wouldn't have to worry about having a 0 in the bottom. Okay, so now the first one's good to go. It has the correct denominator. Then I have a 3x squared. To go from 3 to 6, I need to multiply by 2. The x squared's already there. The last one, I need the 6 to get to the 6x squared, and then I also need another x. So I need to multiply that one, top and bottom, by 6x. Then I don't need my denominators anymore. So I have 1 equals 1 times 2 minus, and it's not a bad idea to put a parentheses, 1 times 6x. But the parentheses here isn't really needed because I have nothing to distribute to. It's just one term. So I have to subtract my 2. So I have negative 1 equals negative 6x. Divide by negative 6. And we get x equals 1/6, which is not 0. So we're good. Okay, so you're either going to have a proportion where you cross multiply, or you have to get a common denominator, and they're going to look like these. It's going to just be a matter of finding something that everything goes into. And then once you get your common denominator, you don't need the denominators at all. Right now, worst comes to worst, if you can't figure out a common denominator, one option is to multiply all of your denominators. That'll get you 1, 2. Right? So I can do x times 5x times 5x, and that would be 25x cubed. It's a little more work because you have to simplify more, but that is a common denominator, and it will still get you to the correct answer.